Thank you, and I would like to just express my thanks to the organisers for organising such a wonderful conference, and to you, the true network of tens, literal tens. As we were hearing yesterday, every regime has a political formula. This is what Gaetano Mosco described as the legal or moral basis by which the ruling class attempts to legitimize its sovereignty. Or in the conceptual framework of Carl Schmitt, every regime has a political theology, a faith commitment underlying its acts and rule. Examples of political formula include the divine right of kings, the pursuit of life, liberty, and happiness, the will of the people, diversity is our strength, and so on. The ruling class use these metaphysical and moral principles to rationalize and justify their decisions to their subjects. Charles I argued that he had the right to raise taxes because he had been appointed by God to have absolute authority over the realm of England, over its property, and thus he has the right to raise taxes on property. It's important to note that even if the rulers themselves don't believe their political formula, they will use it to lend moral credence to their governance. Now, each of us have things that we desire and value. We want some things more than others. Our minds think about how we can attain our prize, and subsequently, we act in ways that will help us to satisfy our desires. Paul Samuelson's concept of revealed preference hits upon this aspect of human nature. While I may say that bananas are my favorite fruit, if every time I go to the store and I buy apples, then my purchases reveal that I desire and value apples more than bananas. I'm willing to spend my money on them. What kind of fruit we like is relatively trivial, but foundational preferences, those things that we value most, are the linchpins directing our thoughts, our emotions, our behavior. They are the ultimate ends or purposes that we live by, often unknowingly and in conflict with our stated beliefs. The man who claims to be a Christian but spends his time getting drunk and sleeping around reveals by his actions that his foundational preference is pleasure rather than Christ. At the core of the ruling class's attempts to build consent, or at least this ruling class's attempt, is our preferences. The regime manufactures consent when, as Mosca argued, the political formula corresponds with the beliefs and sentiments of the masses, those key ones, their religious and philosophical worldviews. Pareto would root the efficacy of a political formula in the sentiments or deepest feelings of the populace. In either case, what matters is that the political formula of the regime aligns with these ultimate values of the governed which direct their behavior. When the ruling elite convince the public, explicitly or tacitly, that their sovereignty and decisions are instrumental to the attainment of those things that they desire most, their rule, their actions, their expansion of power will be afforded legitimacy. Now, elite theorists disagree over whether the rulers cynically use values and ideals as mere instruments for achieving power, as put forward by Pareto and Francis, or whether these myths and ideologies answer a real need in man's social nature to feel that he is governed on the basis of a moral principle, a position held by Mosca and Gottfried. Nevertheless, all four thinkers agree that it is vital for the success of a ruling elite that they gain the assent of the masses. And this explains why the regime expends enormous effort on manufacturing consent. It is important for the masses to accept the political formula because consent is the basis for governance. A regime cannot rule by force alone. The legitimacy of political institutions rests on the active consent of the people, the joining together of the elites and masses into a common political purpose. When the political formula is rejected, the situation is ripe for reset or revolution. James Burnham argued that social revolution can occur, quote, when large sections of the elite lose confidence in themselves and the legitimacy of their own rule, and when in both elite and non-elite there is a loss of faith in the political formulas and myths that have held the social structure together. Erich Hofer likewise suggested that revolutionary movements can only be successful if they are preceded by men of words, the intelligentsia, the priestly and artistic classes who discredit the prevailing creeds and undermine the existing institutions, thereby preparing the way for a new faith or ideology, for acceptance of a violent revolutionary movement. Both thinkers were suggesting that if the values espoused by the ruling elite no longer match those held by the non-governing elite or the masses, they will lose legitimacy and will have to resort to force. It will not be long before a new elite, espousing a political formula more commensurate with the desires and values of the people, will challenge this delegitimized order. Only then will the masses be prepared to reject their old masters and throw their consent behind a new elite. This gives us a clear course of action. We should, among other things, deconstruct and discredit the political formula of the current ruling elite. To do this, we will need to question and evaluate the things that people ought to desire and value most, as may be compared to what commonly is desired most. And this requires an account of the good life. Such an endeavor will tackle the purpose of human life, and as such involves an exploration of human nature and in turn being itself. Once these issues have been addressed in this vision, then we can determine which political formula are legitimate and which are not. In other words, we can imagine what a new world might look like. What we need then is nothing less than the retrieval and construction of metaphysics, anthropology, ethics, and political theory, which is more truthful than the current regimes. It must reflect the whole corpus of human desire, as opposed to the current political formula which, as we will see, limits and distorts life to one or two of these foundational preferences. We will then need to circulate our ideas and shift the values and desires of the non-governing elite and the masses, or at least a sizable portion. And this is no mean feat because, as we were hearing yesterday, managerial elites use mass organizations of culture and communication to control the public. This they achieved through the dissemination, restriction, and invention of information in ways concurrent with their aims. We were hearing about Edward Bernays, one of the founding originators of public relations, who described this process as the engineering of consent through the implementation of mass psychology. This description is apt because it's not just a matter of instilling beliefs. Rather, the regime uses mass media to inculcate and intensify those desires, those preferences, which align with its political formula. Beyond the media, educational institutions such as schools and universities inculcate the values of the political formula in children and future intelligentsia, thereby perpetuating the cycle. Nevertheless, the regime's inability to control the exchange of information online, as evidenced by the attendance in this room, no matter how hard they try to censor dissident voices, is slowly but surely enabling ideas to chip away at its political theology. We must develop tools and pathways of dissemination and inculcation of our own. So, what then is the political formula of the current regime? By what moral basis do they gain the assent of most people? Here, I want to elucidate the way the political formula of the ruling class aligns with at least two foundational preferences: health and happiness. Though we can add in others, in our political system, these two values provide the framework for acceptable policy, whether on the left or right. We might want to suggest, though, that certain factions within the regime emphasize one over the other. We can discuss that in due course. There is agreement that the primary role of the state is to be an instrument of making the masses healthier and happy, to the exclusion of nearly all else. As most people want to live long and be happy, this political formula is tacitly accepted as justifying the ruling class's right to rule and their policies. We can observe these desires are at the heart of the regime by examining its behavior. First, to its promise to preserve life. In 2020, governments across the world placed into lockdown their populations as a response to the COVID pandemic. Whether in the UK or China, Australia or South Africa, at the behest of experts from universities and NGOs, the ruling elite prevented citizens from leaving their homes, shut down businesses, and prohibited travel between countries. While local economies crumbled, corporations swooped in to provide home delivery services and household entertainment, resulting in billions of dollars being transferred from small businesses to the super rich. Churches were closed, congregations prevented from celebrating Easter. Elderly relatives died alone. Around the world, governments increased their security and surveillance powers. The UK Coronavirus Act allowing the state to detain potentially infectious persons, prevent mass gatherings, and imposed criminal sanctions, even prison sentences, for disease transmission. And, of course, vaccination programs were rolled out, the coffers of pharmaceutical giants growing heavier as the unvaccinated became second-class citizens, in many countries unable to work, travel, or partake in leisure activities. Despite enforcing the most stringent restrictions on liberty in our lifetimes, most people complied with these measures. In fact, many actively supported the regime's efforts, lock me down harder, wearing the symbol of the political order, the mask, while showing their gratitude in state-sanctioned ceremonies, such as UK households standing on their doorsteps, banging pots and pans in support of the NHS. And for those of you who don't know, this is Nigel Farage, who led the Brexit campaign. While no doubt a large part of this was due to inertia, it was also because the political formula used to justify these measures aligned with the priorities of the people. The regime justified its rules by claiming that its sovereignty and decisions were essential and instrumental for securing the health of the masses. These people should rule us. They should take away our liberties because they will keep us safe. We should obey their decrees, take the vaccine, and suffer the indignity of being penned in our homes because it will help us to survive. All the forces in society are and should be reoriented towards prolonging life at any cost. Such expectations that the regime will take care of you are not just a recent phenomena. They were set in place in the decades following the Second World War. In the UK, as part of the development of the so-called welfare state, note the name, the Clement Attlee-led Labour government founded the National Health Service. All citizens would pay taxes towards the maintenance of this institution, which would provide medical care which was free at the point of contact. Ever expanding, the NHS has become the 5th largest employer in the world, with 1.7 million employees. Healthcare constitutes 20% of UK government spending, with 167.9 billion expected to be spent this year on day-to-day costs. Prolonging the lives of its patients has extended these costs to social care, including provision for the infirm and elderly. While all other areas of spending are subject to cuts during times of austerity, the NHS is the one area that successive governments are quick to boast about how much money they are increasing in putting into it. Conservative Prime Minister David Cameron famously ring-fenced spending on the NHS while he pursued a policy of cutting almost every area of government spending. Alexander Johnson fulfilled Theresa May's promise to spend a real term increase of 20 billion on the NHS between 2018 and 2024. An average increase of 3.3% per year. Now, why wouldn't they? Since 2016, half of respondents to the annual British Social Attitude Survey believe we should be increasing health spending further than the Conservatives are. Promising to keep its subjects alive for as long as possible, the regime has moved into the business of preventing illness. In 2007, the UK government used both nudge tactics and legal measures to reduce smoking. It was banned in enclosed public spaces on the basis that doing so would reduce passive smoking substantially and encourage smokers to quit the habit. In addition, cigarette packets were plastered with warning labels, graphically depicting the effects of lung cancer, and were by law hidden behind shop counters away from the view of children. Since 2015, NHS England has been developing what are called healthy new towns, designed to place health and well-being at the heart of urban development. And in turn, technocrats such as Lord Ara Dasri, recently speaking at the Future for Britain conference funded by the Tony Blair Institute for Global Change, argued that we need to develop implantable and wearable devices which will continuously and passively monitor the human body, because we would be aware of and be able to treat medical issues before they arise. This will, in his words, enable us to consign disease to history. Medical utopianism preys upon the natural and good desire to survive. Any political formula worth its salt will respect this most basic of values. However, our current regime promises to keep us safe from illness, no matter the cost. Whether they do is a different question. They promise this. They use this pledge to justify the micromanagement of our entire lives, supplemented by the development of the most invasive of technologies. By extension, the public are encouraged to welcome mass migration because our aging populations need a ready supply of healthcare workers. You may remember during the COVID pandemic, a video emerged where it was looking at various immigrants, and they were saying, you should be thankful that we are here because we helped you get through the COVID crisis. Meanwhile, the ruling class reconstruct our private, social, and economic lives to decrease the rate of global warming because, they say, this will keep us safe from the dangers of climate change. In return, the masses, willing to sacrifice everything that makes life worth living to stay alive, submit themselves to what C.S. Lewis called the worldwide paternalism of technocracy. This is to be expected given the current mania for health. A whole industry has popped up to enable individuals to become as healthy as possible. Mark how many steps you have done today. Measure your blood pressure. Check out how healthy your meals are. There is an app to measure the health of every feature of the human body. Everyone is in a state of self-maintenance and monitoring already. Thus, it is little surprise that such people would be willing and happy for the government to lock them down in the name of health. Indeed, they demand it. With this in mind, we should not see the response to the pandemic as exceptional, but rather the logical endpoint of the regime's political formula. Of course, what they promise is in part a lie. The regime cannot end death or eliminate disease. They cannot control the climate. But even if they could, is mere longevity a worthwhile goal? Isn't it more important to live a good life than a long one? Moreover, are there things worth dying for? In previous eras, it was common to believe that it was noble to die and even to kill in defense of one's family, kin, and nation, to die and kill in the service of one's God or in the pursuit of glory. Whereas in the past, the death of a warrior in battle was the highest honor, now we see the death of a soldier as an unmitigated tragedy. Is that true? But let me press this further into a more concrete and maybe perhaps a more challenging example. Suppose we imagine a man who is rather obese. He eats 12 Big Macs a day. And this man, by the course of nature, would very quickly die from this eating. However, with the marvels of modern medicine, we are able to keep this man alive. He can go on for quite a while. This is quite good for McDonald's. They keep getting their Big Macs sold. It's good also for maybe the entertainment industries that he consumes, for the Amazon delivery drivers that have to drop off his stuff every day. He may also be producing YouTube videos, for example. So he's helping the system there, and he's helping the medical and pharmaceutical companies. But is this really a good way of running society? Should a society be run in such a way, or be organized in such a way, where its political formula says, we will keep extending this man's life, that his vice of gluttony will not result in his death? I leave that as an open question. Let us turn to the second foundational preference, the pursuit of happiness. In truth, this too has become medicalized under the auspices of mental health. At its most crude, the political formula takes John Stuart Mill's notion that happiness consists in pleasure and the absence of pain, and then frames this as that which constitutes a healthy mind. Conversely, any emotion which is not pleasurable, such as being anxious or depressed, now is being constituted as a mental illness. And this is not to say that there are not genuine mental illnesses. Drugs and therapists are on offer if you're feeling low. Trigger warnings are placed in talks to prepare you for topics which may cause emotional trauma. Note the medical word applied here to negative feelings. And if you're upset, you can always go to a safe space free from microaggressions and anything else which makes you feel uncomfortable. The UK government is now taking this so seriously that police forces are arresting people who post on Twitter things which, to quote the officer involved, caused anxiety. For of course, the elimination of all emotional anxiety will require the constant micromanagement of the inner life and all that affects it, namely everything, by technocrats and government officials. The integration of human and artificial intelligence will enhance this process. The synthesis of man and machine justified because, as founder of the Transhumanist Society, David Pearce argues, such technology will be used to eradicate all physical and mental pain, providing a world of, quote, sublime and all-pervasive happiness. Simultaneously, what Thomas Szasz has coined the therapeutic state, to which I've been referring, interprets all unwanted behavior as pathological, a form of sickness. C.S. Lewis noted that the British legal system, as early as the 1930s, had moved away from a system which punished criminals according to what their crimes deserved, justice, towards a remedial process that aims to cure criminals of those mental defects which cause their criminal activities. The criminal becomes a patient, indefinitely removed of their rights until they are cured. They can be subject to the most inhuman treatment, physically and mentally tortured until they are reprogrammed into a compliant husk of their former selves. The USSR treated religious and political dissenters as sufferers of psychopathological mechanisms and confined them to mental hospitals. In the West, Theodor Adorno's The Authoritarian Personality Type diagnosed the fascist as mentally ill and as a sexually repressed individual. More on that later. It was an easy step for psychologists to apply this to the conservative or right-winger more generally. Gottfried makes the salient point that by relegating a whole host of controversial issues to that of mental illness, the regime disguises its use of force against political dissidents behind the seemingly neutral, and we might add widely accepted, promotion of healthcare and happiness. You'll have noted so far I haven't mentioned woke in particular, but however, no account of the current regime's promotion of happiness or mental health could be complete unless it engages with the prominence of LGBTQ+ activism and inclusivity in our society. As a symbol of our regime, US embassies around the world fly the pride flag, while Conservative Party members like Tom Harwood argue that there is nothing more conservative than sexual liberation. Every year, our nations celebrate gay pride, maybe even every month nowadays, while our children are given what is called gender-affirming care. All of this is in the name of health and happiness. After all, it is commonplace for parents to say that they accept their child's non-normative sexuality or gender because they want them to be happy. They don't often say they want them to be good. I want to turn here to the psychoanalysis of Wilhelm Reich. You probably know him best from his development of the infamous orgone energy accumulator, referenced in Kate Bush's song Cloudbusting, Jack Kerouac's The Road, and it was even owned by high-profile celebrities such as Sean Connery. This device sought to open up the mind and body to what Reich believed was the orgasmic energy that permeates and constitutes the cosmos. Sadly, in 1954, the FDA labeled Reich's work fraudulent and arrested him later in 1956. He died a year later. However, what concerns us here is his earlier self-described Freudo-Marxism, which he developed in Austria and Germany during the 1920s and 30s. Reich's ideas can help us to understand the relationship between healthcare and sexual liberation in the regime's political formula. Though largely forgotten today, Reich had a significant impact upon figures like Alfred Kinsey, whose infamous reports paved the way towards a more liberal attitude concerning sexuality in the early 1960s. Moreover, a 1964 Time magazine article was dedicated to Reich, describing him as a prophet as America underwent its sexual revolution. While in Germany during the same period, Reich's works were the main texts that were being distributed and bootlegged during the student uprising of 1968. His dictums, his writings even being graffitied around Frankfurt as students campaigned for sexual liberation. Nevertheless, I'm not arguing that Reich's psychoanalysis was the sole or even main origin of the ideology underpinning the sexual revolution and its modern incarnation. I'm suggesting that his system of thought best articulates the inner logic of the regime's political formula, even if members of it are not aware of it. In his magnum opus, The Mass Psychology of Fascism, Reich begins by asking an important question. Why was the Weimar Republic replaced by National Socialism rather than communism? Life in 1920s Germany was intolerable. Many working class men and women unemployed and starving. According to Marxist theory, the economic and social conditions were such that the proletariat ought to have revolted as a matter of necessity against the bourgeoisie in this time. Yet they did not. Rather, the masses supported and elected a fascist and reactionary authoritarian government. And many of the Marxists struggled to understand why did this take place. In Reich's view, the Marxist theorists had neglected the psychological character of the masses. Every social order, he wrote, creates for itself in the masses of its members that structure which is needed for its main purposes. They identify the interests of the ruling elite with their own by virtue of their psychology. Thus, while the economic and social conditions of Germany were ripe for revolution, the psychology of the populace was not. Without a shift in the ideology and emotions of the people, any attempt at economic and political change would necessarily result in something like the Nazis. Thus, psychological revolution must take place prior to economic or political revolution. Reich analyzed the psychological character of the masses using Freudian psychoanalysis, though departing from his mentor in some significant ways. The vital motivator in life is the libido, the desire for sexual pleasure. This forms the good, pure, and beautiful core of human being. Psychological health rests on the unmitigated and unqualified satisfaction of the libido for Reich. The development of the sexual instinct begins with infants, many engaged in masturbatory practices if left unchecked. This, Reich claimed, was evidenced by humanity's primal origins in primitive tribes, which, in his view, were matriarchal, and thus accepted child sexuality as par for the course. This changed with the development of patriarchal authoritarian power structures, which provided the basis for the class system. Monogamous marriage and the family unit form the bedrock of bourgeois civilization and culture, economically in terms of inheritance, socially with relation to the protection of mothers and infants. By extension, chastity before marriage is imposed through culture. Thus, sexual desire, the libido, is repressed. This begins in the family itself. Parents prohibit their children from masturbating, while adolescents are forced into abstinence. The repression of sexual desire creates a mentally ill individual, a sex-starved patient who develops internal feelings of sexual guilt and shame, suffering various pathological neuroses. At the same time, the sexually repressed individual feels afraid of authority and is compliant to command. In time, this makes them willing supporters of the authoritarian regime, primed to follow the morality of the ruling class to suppress their sexual instincts, as their parents had done before. This is further enhanced by the authoritarian regime's provision of outlets for those sexual urges suppressed in the unconscious, such as in the military uniform or the parade, the pleasure of inflicting sadistic violence, and so on. Thus, whereas Freud believed that sexual repression was biologically rooted, for Reich, it takes place through the social structure. The family is the factory of the regime's structure and ideology. By implication, the authoritarian or fascist regime originates in and is maintained by the sexual repression of the masses. Therefore, there must be first a sexual revolution, then the economic and political revolution will follow. Reich believed this would begin by setting the libido free. This required the destruction of the family unit, the primary place where the father could instill in his children sexual inhibitions. This could be developed by the forging of a matriarchal culture within which women were financially independent from a male provider and free from the constraints of raising children. To this end, contraceptives and abortion should be widely accessible. Additionally, children should not be raised by their parents. Rather, children should be raised by the state, where they will receive sexual education from experts who would best teach them how to embrace their inner desires. For those adults who have been raised to repress their sexuality, extensive therapy is required. Through these measures, the sexually liberated masses will be ready to revolt against the bourgeois overlords and establish a communist society of peace and harmony. Reich's Freudo-Marxism reveals perhaps one of the foundational preferences that drives the LGBTQ+ movement. Pleasurable feelings, particularly those that are taboo, constitute a healthy mind, even humanity itself. We should indulge all our impulses. The sexual and gender non-conforming feelings of children are suppressed by the family unit, particularly by heteropatriarchal white men who are afraid of and repress their sexuality. The phobias and prejudices of these mentally ill men, plagued by toxic masculinity, harm the health of their children and cause violent conflict in the world. No wonder our leaders, such as Boris Johnson, reckon a global order run by women and guided by children would be more peaceful and enlightened. As such, women need to be liberated from authoritarian men, the pill and abortion essential to their economic and social freedom. Kids need to receive affirming care from the regime without the consent of their parents so that their sexual or gender feelings can be liberated. The family unit, so Black Lives Matter tells us, must be destroyed, as it is a weapon of the white patriarchy against queer identities. Every woman in power is a stand against the patriarchy. Every gay couple is a rebellion against the fascists. Every trans child, a victory over the Nazis. The liberation of sexual desire and gender nonconformity makes the world a healthier and happier place. When the World Economic Forum proposed a vision of the future summarized by the slogan, "You'll own nothing and you'll be happy," they were not too far off from the regime's political formula. While many expressed anger and outrage at this idea, the revealed preferences of the masses is that many of them would want this. They will consent to a regime which will keep them safe and happy, a regime whose political formula is one of ensuring that you will have a healthy body and mind. This project, with its focus upon sexual liberation as a gateway to happiness, is inherently anti-fascist, no matter how authoritarian its measures. If the regime offered everlasting happiness at the price of absolute submission, would most people take it? Would you? If we want to break the compliance with the regime, we must alter the desires of the populace and the non-governing elite. This conference has asked us to choose a way forward between logos and praxis. I submit to you perhaps a middle way, that of pathos, the appeal to the emotions. What people value most is not a matter of the head alone, but also of the heart, perhaps even primarily of the heart. If we want to break the alignment of the preferences and political formula, we must change the way people feel about the world, what it is that they want most. This will take nothing short of producing something like mass conversions. Carlyle described the nature of these transformations as follows. There will a radical, universal alteration of your regimen and way of life take place. There will a most agonizing divorce between you and your chimeras, luxuries and falsities take place. A most toilsome, all but impossible return to nature and her veracities and her integrities take place, that so the inner fountains of life may again begin, like eternal light fountains, to irradiate and purify your bloated, swollen, foul existence, drawing nigh, as at present, to nameless death. In conjunction with the intellectual critique of the regime's political formula, we must pursue means through which we can change the desires of the non-governing elite and masses. In the brief time remaining, I want to illustrate one of these ways. I want to draw our attention to a passage in The Lord of the Rings. Following the sundering of the Fellowship at Amon Hen, Aragorn, Legolas, and Gimli are on the trail of a party of orcs who have taken their companions captive. As they track them down across the plains, they are confronted by a troop of riders, Knights of Rohan. Eomer, a battle-hardened warrior, is suspicious of our three protagonists, fearing that they may be spies of the wizard Saruman. We pick up the passage with him asking, "Come, who are you? Whom do you serve? At whose command do you hunt orcs in our land?" "I serve no man," said Aragorn, "but the servants of Sauron I pursue into whatever land they may go. There are few among mortal men who know more of orcs, and I do not hunt them in this fashion out of choice. The orcs whom we pursued took captive two of my friends. In such need, a man that has no horse will go on foot, and he will not ask for leave to follow the trail. Nor will he count the heads of his enemy, save with a sword. I am not weaponless." Aragorn threw back his cloak. The elven sheath glittered as he grasped it, and the bright blade of Anduril shone like a sudden flame as he swept it out. "Elendil," he cried, "I am Aragorn, son of Arathorn, and am called Elessar, the Elfstone, Dunedain, the heir of Isildur, Elendil, son of Gondor. Here is the sword that was broken and is forged again. Will you aid me or thwart me? Choose swiftly." Gimli and Legolas looked at their companion in amazement, for they had not seen him in this mood before. He seemed to have grown in stature, while Eomer had shrunk, and in this living face they caught a brief vision of the power and majesty of the kings of stone. For a moment, it seemed to the eyes of Legolas that a white flame flickered on the brows of Aragorn like a shining crown. Now, I could have explained the idea of Carlyle's concept of hero worship in an abstract way to you. I could have defined it in a logical approach. But I hope by reading this passage, I've given you a taste of what hero worship is like, an experience of what it is like to be in the presence of a great man. A man who's willing to give up life and happiness for his friends. This speaks to the character of human nature. We do not learn about the world first and foremost through abstract reasoning. Rather, we come to know the world through experience, through engagement and encounter with concrete realities. Mythology bridges the two, presenting to us abstract truths in clothing of narrative and symbols. Indeed, the great man himself is an incarnation of that thing that he is most devoted to. Through them, the same is true of a Shakespearean play, a symphony by Beethoven, or a carving by Michelangelo. Through them, we experience truth, and through repeated engagement with the great man, narrative, and art, we are taught, little by little, to conform our desires with the good and the beautiful. What I am suggesting is that the formation of a creative movement. We are already seeing the seeds of poetry and art flourishing within this sphere. We should be encouraging and supporting novelists, playwrights, musicians, artists, and filmmakers, and at the same time develop mechanisms for the dissemination of their works. This must be in tandem with the intellectual project that I was referring to earlier, of building a new or retrieving a vision of humanity and what the world could look like in the future. The two will naturally feed into each other. The intellectuals are going to be opening up what it is that we are feeling, what it is we are longing for. The creatives will open up dimensions of reality, new perceptions upon the world around us. In this talk, I have been arguing that every regime has a political formula, and that consent consists in the alignment of the formula with the foundational preferences of the non-governing elite and the masses. In our culture, the ruling class justify their sovereignty and decisions on the basis of health and happiness. They promise safety from death, security from pain, and sexual satisfaction. One way to clear out this regime is to fracture the consent of the populace. This will be perhaps achieved by a two-pronged approach: the intellectual deconstruction of the formula and an attempt to transform the foundational desires of the ruled. Therefore, we need to pursue logos and pathos, and in so doing, we will pave the way for men of praxis. Thank you.
Hello. Very good talk, by the way. Near the beginning, you talked about health and happiness and how really the regime considers the masses as a farmer would consider livestock. They're vaccinated, they're kept in a state of subsistence. And you talk about countering it with higher-minded ideas, almost like the Maslow's hierarchy of needs, self-actualization. There's I don't know, not to be the resident black pill person in the room, but there's another idea though that a darker idea that people have is like, what if the masses do want to be cattle though? What if you offer people a new vision and a new consent that is based on higher ideas, and they simply reject it and would like to live in the pod and eat the bugs, basically? What would be your reaction to that idea?
Well, I definitely think that, this was something I was toying with. Another approach could be we just go full in on this, right? And we say, no, we're going to make sure that you are healthy and you are happy even more than the current regime. And in a way, that's part of what the complaint is at the moment, that, okay, our NHS, you can't get a doctor's appointment, you can't get a dental appointment, so let's get rid, well, on a party basis, let's get rid of the Conservatives because Labour might sort it out. And then the techno-globalists, that's essentially their push, right? They're saying, well, if we had this kind of international alliance underneath, let's say, the World Economic Forum or one of these other institutions, then you will be healthier and you will be happier. There's a very real possibility that would be the way it could go. And if it's not our view, it's certainly a rival competitor at the moment. However, I don't think that is a good approach because it's not true. It's not true to life, because actually it's better to live a short and good life than a long life, for a start. And I also believe that people are, even if you know, every regime has an elite and a governed class, right? So that there is that dynamic. But I don't think that just keeping people alive for the sake of more money, consume and all that such a thing is a good society. And I don't think most of the people in this room believe that either. So I don't think we should pursue that vision for that reason. But I definitely could see it is a rival, and you could make it a viable alternative if that's the way you wanted to go.
Very interesting talk.
Oh.
Again, following on from the health and happiness, we saw very early in COVID, of course, go out, hug a Chinaman, and more recently with monkeypox, that it's just skin-on-skin contact. You don't need to stop engaging in certain acts. It seems to me that the happiness seems to be at the forefront of the preferred groups and out-groups, whereas for the masses it's health that's the key driver. Do you think there's a wedge that can be used there, or some other significance?
Thank you. It's I was thinking about the monkeypox thing last night, actually, because in a way I think you're right that it's appealing to different groups, like which group maybe they're promoting different different values, but also factions within the regime at large maybe are emphasizing different things. You might see perhaps the American regime at the moment, the government, is essentially promoting sexual and gender liberation very strongly, and it's coming into conflict with something like the World Health Organization and the technocrats who are promoting the health aspect. You could definitely put a wedge in there because, well, we've seen lots of people saying, you know, you locked us down for a long time. We couldn't see our relatives who were in care homes and whatnot, but you're allowed to go and have gay orgies whenever you like, even if it's going to spread the disease. I'm a bit hesitant though, because then are we pushing ourselves on these values, and is that the kind of society that we want to build? If it is a health maxing society, then great, but you're playing in the game that's already been set, and in some ways if you're playing the health side, you're going to be supporting people like the WHO. If you're playing the other side, you're helping the current American regime. So you could play it if you wanted to be sneaky. Yeah. Thank you.
Why do you hate health and happiness so much? No, my serious question, I do have a serious question. My serious question is that, like, okay, so you said the regime is promoting these as the two master values, and that we want to replace it with others, and it just seems to me like that the list of possible other values is endless. Like, it could be truth, beauty, stability, adventure, goodness knows what. And so we've got to make some choices here about which specific ones we have to promote, and those choices need to be driven by at least two things. One, it needs to be something that's sufficiently seductive to get people away from the current master values, and two, they need to actually be good and lead to something we want. And I wondered whether you had a view about which specific values we should be promoting to try and replace these ones.
Well, in answer to your first point, I study Puritanism, so that might have been an impact upon me. But in part, I didn't want to prescribe necessarily what the values were in the talk, because in essence that might close down the actual exploration that's required. I think though that, and we were hearing this yesterday, that it shouldn't be about creating something new necessarily, but actually retrieving and recovering what's already in the tradition. What's there? We already have, for example, you could go down an Aristotelian virtue approach. So living the good life, one of moderation and control. So a moderated health system, for example. Or, that gets integrated by Aquinas into a life which is honoring to God. So a society about surrounding that. I want to give people the opportunity to just go and to create poetry, to write novels, to create art which is actually responsive to the tradition, but also seeing it in the current context. And maybe through that then, we will have a new formulation of these principles and values which can drive us forward. I don't think I could give that at the moment. That needs to be that's the next step, essentially. Yeah. Thank you.
I think you mentioned non-governing elites at one point. Would you like to say a little bit more about that? Because when I heard that, I thought this could be the key. This could be a key sector. To approach.
Sorry, go ahead.
Yeah.
So within the regime, we were hearing on Friday with AA's talk that you've got different levels within the octopus. Now, we might want to configure it in different ways, but essentially you have the sovereigns, but then people who administer their rule, perhaps not even directly, but take your HR department in many places. They're not getting orders from BlackRock directly or from Joe Biden, right? But they are instituting the regime's policies on, diversity quotas and such like. So they form part of that non-governing elite, and that could be in the media, it could be in education, etc. And so, I think if this kind of group, we need to really think about then how we're going to approach them, because they're a substantial part of the Yeah, go ahead.
Clarification: would you include independently wealthy people, like for example, entrepreneurs who's retired and were living off land money, for example, or so you've talked about the technocracy within the technocratic structure, but would you include independently wealthy people, entrepreneurs, for example, who in that non-governing elite who wouldn't have an interest in politics, who aren't directly served or haven't taken an interest or allied with the ruling elites? Would you include those in the non-governing elites? Okay.
Or a potential, yeah. And I'll give you an example of this kind of influence, and it was kind of indirect actually. So take somebody like Elon Musk or Jeff Bezos. They both claim that the Culture series. Have you come across the Culture series by Ian Banks? It's a sci-fi novels, and it sets out a vision of a future where human society is controlled primarily through technology, through AI. It's totally governed in that way. Musk claims this is a big influence upon his whole ethos in life and how he approaches what he does. So that automatically shows you the power that a novel can have on the elites or the non-governing elites, right? So that gives us some kind of inspiration then, okay, we've got something we could work with here.
Morning, Nathan. Thanks for the excellent talk. I would say if we were going to redefine British values, I think you just go back to Disraeli, who defined it as freedom, justice and property, really. And that was the animating principle of all English law. And I think if you, certainly for us naming ourselves reactionaries, if you're not going back and bringing out the values of the past, you're not, and you're trying to make something new, you're not a reactionary, you're a progressive. You just happen to be a right-wing one. One of the things in the sort of health and happiness drive is that it's so obviously untrue because it makes people fat and lonely and miserable and unproductive, and consumerism is obviously bad for people, and I think the more we point that out, the more obvious it becomes. But on the subject of what you replace it with, I've noticed that there's certain words that have dropped completely out of the lexicon. Things like earnestness, seriousness, duty is a big one. When people talk about your your contributions that, living in a community, but they never talk about the duties you have to do to uphold that community. So I'm just wondering your thoughts on that sort of positive vision of, yes, being a good person is labour intensive, but you have to do it, otherwise you will end up in a pod alone eating bugs.
Yeah, and on the first point, I think we could see, Curtis was talking yesterday about the kind of fragility and the doubts within the formula we've got at the moment. And that's definitely one. There's a huge discrepancy between the health drive and what it's producing. I think you're totally right that responsibility is a key part of that. And actually all of the kind of the visions I was alluding to, so the Aristotelian virtuous man, or the life given in devotion to God, there's a relationship there between a higher and yourself that you have to uphold, that you have to pursue for the good life. Not just for yourself, but for your community, for those that you don't even know. This is really key. And so I think any vision which we want to put forward needs to have that responsibility at the heart of it, in part because the life where one a life led, given to duty and responsibility, is one that can put health aside, can put happiness aside for those things in those moments. So yeah, I would agree full-heartedly with that. Thank you.
I think if we had a way of getting rid of hangovers as part of the Any more questions?
Good morning. I think you've done a good job of outlining where a lot of these trends start, which is always interesting. I wonder, you said at one point that really the reaction to COVID was just sort of the logical, natural conclusion of where we are. I wonder, why do you think we've seen this sort of acceleration, especially 2016, but 2020 especially? Is there something that's caused that, or is that purely just an outcome that was always going to take place?
Thank you. It's a good question. I think in part because the ideas have been and values are instilled so strongly now that it was possible to take place. I'm not sure if you had done this 50 years ago, whether people would have been accepting of it. Maybe they would have been. We could discuss that. You also have the issue of so lockdown was possible in part because people could be entertained in their homes. They could have a degree of comfort and happiness through Amazon delivery services, and then you've got your Netflix and YouTube and whatnot. So that aspect of it too, and enabled it in a way that maybe 20 years ago it might not have had the same possibilities. But as for specific causes, I wouldn't know. I'd need to think more about that. Yeah, thank you.
Just to get right onto that point, I just wanted to point out, if I wanted to get really conspiratorial, that if anyone remembers that the very week that the first lockdown sent everyone home, Microsoft Teams application was, I think it was like still in beta. Like there were people using it, but it only just launched. And though we've had teleconferencing software and DMs for a while, it was kind of weird how we've only just, and now everyone uses Teams, at least in my industry, and we're having laptops, webcams, headphones readily available for everyone. I don't think it would have been possible to have a lockdown without it, because the huge sectors of the economy would just cease to continue. Sorry to answer a question on your behalf. I just wanted to get into the conversation. What do you think about that?
You also, it's remarkable how suddenly overnight Zoom became a thing as well. There'd been Skype for many years. I'd never heard of Zoom, and then suddenly next week at work, oh, we're using Zoom now. Get on with it. And that transition from working at home was really critical to that. And you know, as I was alluding to earlier, it allows people who wouldn't be able to go to work normally anyway. So my 12 Big Macs guy that I was talking about, he could work from home. So it facilitates that part of it too. It keeps the medical cycle going.
We have time for one more question. Anybody?
Yeah, very well spoken speech, very well good. So the values you identified, health and happiness, they seem to be very good positive values of them. But what I seem to notice is they also have degenerate values as well that seem to be corrupted. So if we wanted to implement something, you know, like a sense of duty in people, well, duty seems to be more focused toward, you know, the average plebeian, you could say, feels more duty towards the local football team, or a sense of honour that is corrupted instead of a sense to honour in a fair fight. It's more honour, you know, trying to impress the local girl at the club. And so I'm thinking, what methods could we implement to get around these degenerated values that they've implemented?
I think it's a great point because you know, for Carlyle, we are creatures which desire to give loyalty to things. And for him, that desire should manifest in loyalty to the great man, the person who bears the noble ideal. But in our society, this gets substituted in various ways, and I think sports is a great example of that. It substitutes because we see great sporting achievements, and then we confer our loyalty to the team that's doing that. It also substitutes for patriotism as well in various ways. I think it is through this creative process of creating or retrieving archetypes of various kinds. So, you know, I was using Aragorn here. He embodies the Arthurian Beowulf in various ways. He-Man, for example, we had up there. So there's definitely a way to do that in retrieving forms which will draw out that loyalty. And then in turn, we ourselves becoming such people that people want to show loyalty to, or at least becoming a community where great men could originate. I think that's really key as well. Thank you.